Did the Home Secretary break the ministerial code? Does the NHS need more money or more reform? And should Britain pay slavery reparations? This is Politics Live. Joining me today, Conservative Chair of the Women and Equalities Committee, Caroline Noakes, Labour MP, Clive Lewis, The Guardian's political editor, Pippa Crerar, and Telegraph columnist, Madeline Grant. On today's programme.
Any regrets, Home Secretary? Are you subject to different laws than the rest of us, Home Secretary?
She took the points and a fine in the end, but is the political pain for the Home Secretary going to be worse?
It's just be normal, like the people who we represent.
Historically, I think we have a perception of being the nasty party.
What path to electoral success for the Tories?
I know that money makes a difference, but it only gets you so far.
The NHS needs reform, not just more cash. Is Keir Starmer right?
Trying to unpick our history is not the right way forward, and it's not something that we will focus our energies on.
But Clive Lewis says we should pay reparations for slavery. Well, let's start with the story you heard there in the headlines about the Home Secretary, Suella Braverman. She's certainly across the front pages in this row over speeding. Let's have a look at The Guardian. Pressure on Prime Minister to launch inquiry into Braverman's speeding row. We can also take a look at The Mirror, fast track her out. And finally, in The Telegraph, Braverman smear fears over curbs on migrants. Before we get to that, the Prime Minister has been consulting his ethics advisor about how Suella Braverman handled this speeding offence. As far as we know at the moment, they're still gathering information, but apparently Rishi Sunak, the Prime Minister, reportedly didn't know about the story until it was covered in the Sunday Times yesterday. Now, The Telegraph headline is referring to net migration figures that are due out on Thursday this week. They're expected to be very large, and there has been a debate ongoing inside government about whether to bring in new curbs on immigration. So, my opening question, starting with you, Caroline, is what's a bigger problem, do you think, for the Home Secretary? This week's immigration figures or the story about her speeding fine?
Well, I think we learned some years ago now from both Chris Huhne and Fiona Onasanya that if you get a speeding ticket, pay up, be honest, get it over and done with. There is no shame in taking your punishment. And indeed, I can remember years and years ago having to do one of those courses, and it was a very bonding moment, I have to say, with a bunch of my constituents. We'd all been bad. We all accepted the punishment. And I think hugely regrettable that Suella didn't just take the points and pay the fine at the first opportunity. However, look, I think moving on this week, there is a significant issue with immigration, with the immigration numbers. I can remember when I was immigration minister, and that too was some years ago. It was bad if the net figures passed 200,000, and it looks like on Thursday they're going to be way, way in excess of that. And the narrative around immigration, the challenges with both small boats but also with legal migration, student visas, what we're doing about making sure we have enough people working in the NHS. It's very difficult and I would argue insoluble problem that can't be fixed with soundbites. And I think that has been the problem over the last few years, really. We're trying to fix something that's very complicated with a few glib phrases.
What do you think is more problematic politically for the Home Secretary, Clive? She did take the points and paid the fine in the end, but she's reported Suella Braverman to have asked civil servants to help her arrange a one-on-one driving awareness course after she was caught speeding in order to avoid the group session that Caroline has just outlined, which could have, of course, ended up in the press, which it has anyway.
Yeah, I think that she should have taken it on the chin, and I think Caroline was right. Rather than try and schmeagle your way via using a civil servant to kind of get some kind of special treatment. And I think, I remember a Glaswegian political advisor once telling me it's not the murder you go down for, it's the cover-up. And I think that's what this looks like. It's what and that's what this feels like. I think there's another issue here, a kind of slightly deeper issue for me politically, which is that this does seem to be something that is recurring in politics. And it does sometimes feel, and I think the way the public look at this, they look at politicians, a political class, looking as if the rules don't apply to them, the laws don't apply to them in the same way. And that's really undermines our democracy. But it's not just politically, it's also, if you think about water companies being able to, flush vast amounts of turdage down into our water, our drinking water, our rivers, and then get away with it. There doesn't seem to be any... So I think there's this kind of feeling at the moment that things aren't working, that some people can get away with things. Energy companies can put in energy meters into some of the poorest, most vulnerable people in society and not pay anything for it, and yet make vast profits. So I think, I always kind of seem to come back to this, but I think there is a sense that there's one rule for most people and another rule for others. And that's corrosive to politics and democracy.
What do you think will be more difficult for her, for Suella Braverman, this week? In terms of these two issues? Will it be the speeding fine and the way she handled it, reportedly, or will it be the immigration figures?
Well, will she last to the end of the week? I mean, even if Rishi Sunak
even get the immigration figures?
Well, I think she'll still be Home Secretary by the end of the week. If it comes down to whether there's an inquiry into what's happened, that will obviously be fairly quick, but probably take about a week to establish the facts. And I think it's quite important to say that the sanction isn't necessarily, these days, doesn't necessarily have to be you either stay in post and you're absolved, or you have to quit. There's a range of sanctions in between, particularly for more minor offences. But there is one school of opinion going around the Commons this morning about whether actually Suella Braverman might see this as an opportunity to jump before she's pushed. We've had a lot of commentary from her and her allies since she took over. Some of it quite difficult for the government, some of it not actually pursuing what you might think that would be the most helpful route for the government on some of her immigration rhetoric, for example. And then we saw her last week at the NatCon conference setting out what looked very much to a lot of her colleagues like a bit of a Conservative leadership bid. Should she decide that the two key things, and the government keeps banging on about delivery, if she's unable to deliver on the two key things, which is to get net migration down overall and to tackle the small boats crisis by the time of the next election, she might just conclude that is there really any point? Would she not be better off out of government, being able to criticise more openly, and come the next election? And to me, it seems that she is very much focused on who becomes Tory leader after that point.
Which is the bigger problem for her this week?
I think it's ultimately going to be the net migration figures, because every time the British public has actually had the opportunity to vote for more or less immigration, they have historically gone for less. And yet has never been enacted into policy. And as Caroline pointed out, this has been really escalating in the last few years. I think that for Suella Braverman, this is dangerous, not least because, as Clive said, this feeds into a pre-existing feeling of one rule for us, another for them. Even though, it is fair to say, I think that asking civil servants to potentially investigate a course of action is a bit different to ordering them to go ahead and pursue that, if that makes sense.
Yes, I mean, the whole point is whether or not the ministerial code, as we talk about, has been breached. And the code actually says ministers must not ask civil servants to act in any way which would conflict with the Civil Service Code. And on the other hand, civil servants mustn't misuse their official position to further their private interests or those of others. That's going to be the bar, isn't it?
Yes, and if you listen to what Suella Braverman's people are saying this morning, they're suggesting that she asked for advice. However, other sources and the stories of the weekend and people I've spoken to suggest that actually she instructed them. And that is the key difference, because under the ministerial code, it's not just that no conflict should arise, it's also that there's no perception or appearance of conflict between public and private interests. Ministers should not ask their officials, whether they're special advisors or civil servants, to look after the children, do their shopping, or sort their speeding fine.
I like the way they've actually spelt it out.
But it's also incredibly naive, given that there's been so much leaking from the civil service. It's been leakier than a sieve recently. To think that this would go no further, I think it also shows a real political naivety and a lack of foresight on her part, a lack of judgment.
What do you think, just from what you've heard, Caroline, what would your judgment be in terms of Suella Braverman and the ministerial code?
Well, I think we have to wait until whatever commentary the Prime Minister gets, both from Suella and who knows whether there'll be an investigation or not. I noticed on the Telegraph today you've got Mr Loophole Nick Freeman, I think it is, saying that actually it's perfectly commonplace for him to have organised private one-to-one speed awareness courses for clients. Now, I don't want to think of our former Attorney General going to somebody who uses the name Mr Loophole, but maybe this can happen. I mean, maybe it's perfectly feasible. I just think very ill-judged to even try it.
Right. I mean, and do you agree with Madeleine that actually in the end it'll be the net migration figures that will perhaps be more difficult politically?
Oh, look, Clive made the point perfectly accurately that it's the cover-up that does for you. But I think fundamentally, when you hitch your wagon to getting immigration down and it shoots up, you have a very serious problem.
Well, and I think fairly recently, either at conference or certainly when running for the leadership, she's still pledging to bring it down to below 100,000, and even the most recent figures were 540. So
it'd be nice to have a grown-up conversation about it, though. I mean, obviously, you know, people seeking asylum coming over in small boats is completely different from other aspects of migration. But the economy, there is clearly a shortfall of people trained to do certain things post-Brexit, and what that means is that there are people being sucked in elsewhere, as well as the fact that students who took a downturn during COVID are now increasing in numbers. They're coming back into an HE sector desperate for those funds, and yet they're included in those figures. So I think we have to have a kind of a proper, honest, open conversation about what we'll take, what we'll accept and what we won't, because clearly there is an economic impact. When you don't have people able to do those things, that drives prices up. And things, we see those shortages sometimes on the supermarket shelves. We have to have that conversation. What do people want? Food shortages in some sectors? Or net migration figures slightly higher? I mean, those are the kind of conversations we'll need to have. Well,
we've been having them, and we'll talk about them again, of course, when those figures come out on Thursday. Pippa, let's just refer to this story in The Guardian. This is Suella Braverman tried to get out a final vote on Small Boats Bill. This is the illegal migration bill that the government is introducing. What would be the motivation for her trying to get out of that?
I was told she wanted to go on a visit to a police station to make, her critics suggest it was for a photo opportunity. She actually wanted to go to promote the increase in numbers of police on the front line. The suggestion is, from people I spoke to, that she thinks that there's, as Clive referred to, one set of rules for her. And even though it's the government's flagship bit of legislation going through the Commons at the moment, certainly for her department, she felt that it was OK to get her officials to send repeated emails to the Whip's admin team and to try and get her out of the vote. And actually, I'm told, ultimately, the Chief Whip himself had to call her up and say, you're going to be there.
She's a bullet magnet.
It's embarrassing for them, isn't it?
She's a bullet magnet. For Rishi Sunak, he has to accept that Suella Braverman is a bullet magnet. That's what the term we use to... And she's going to attract fire now. She's just up there on a pedestal.
Is that what
and I think so. And if he wants some... It might be useful having someone and it can be. I mean, if you've been in the military, you'll know that having a bullet magnet means that you're probably a bit safer.
Is that what she's
But that's not that... Well, I think she... Well, I think she is slightly...
No, I don't see her as that at all. I'm surprised if Suella was trying to not be there for the vote on the Small Boats Bill, because actually this should be a policy that she was proud of and wanting to see pushed through the Commons. But I think Suella provides a very important, I hesitate to use the word sop, but factor that the right of the party like her. You clearly saw the PM brought her back in when he took over because she was popular on that wing of the party. I think she's an important member of his government to keep her there. But she's not making it easy for him, is she?
No, well, talking of Rishi Sunak, he didn't look best pleased, it has to be said, to be asked about the story about the Home Secretary's speeding fine and how it was handled at the G7 summit in Japan over the weekend. Let's have a look.
Thank you, Prime Minister. Chris Mason, BBC News. Will you ask the Independent Advisory on Ministers' Interests to look into your Home Secretary's conduct after she asked civil servants to help her deal with being caught speeding? And do you have full confidence in Suella Braverman?
Did you have any questions about the summit?
Others will, I think.
Great. Well, Chris, I don't know the full details of what has happened, nor have I spoken to the Home Secretary. I think you can see firsthand what I've been doing over the last day or so. But I understand that she's expressed regret for speeding, accepted the penalty, and paid the fine.
Well, since he talked about, yes, he looks clearly very, very irritated, doesn't he? Yeah, absolutely, bestriding the world stage and talking about Suella Braverman's fine. Well, let's have a listen to the woman herself being asked about it today.
I got a speeding ticket, I paid the fine, I took the points. In my view, nothing untoward has happened.
There you go, Madeline. All done and dusted.
Done and dusted. I think not. Perhaps I think it will all depend what the ethics advisor says. And given that when Rishi Sunak entered number 10, he made a big feature of trying to clean up the perceived mess and the lack of trust and the decline of trust.
The accountability,
all of
the
that
integrity.
Stuff. Yeah,
I think regretting that now.
Professionalism.
Well, I mean, I suppose, yes. I mean, it is very unfortunate, not least because it means that it's very hard to set your agenda and craft the narrative when, you know, all we're talking about are these series of mini crises. It's very unhelpful for a PM who's still trying to set his narrative and explain what he's trying to do to the public. But I think, you know, having set out that stall as someone who's big on ethics and accountability, it will ultimately come down to what his ethics advisor says and what the due process is thereafter.
I mean, he was really irritated, Rishi Sunak, wasn't he, by being asked about this in Japan, understandably, I suppose.
He was, and as Madeline says, he's been trying to move on from the Boris Johnson era, yet at every single turn, whether it was Nadhim Zahawi, Gavin Williamson, Dominic Raab, now Suella Braverman, his senior ministers, people that he appointed, that he judged were fit to be in his cabinet, have ended up getting into trouble. And throughout, all the polling suggests that he outperforms the Conservative Party with the public, and yet every time the frankly quite trashed now Conservative brand pulls him down. And that's going to be a problem for him going for the election, even if the public think that he's somebody they want to see as Prime Minister.
Which makes sense to why they're running a presidential campaign in terms of pushing Rishi over.
But then people will go to the ballot box and will be voting for the Conservatives, regardless of who leads them, or not voting for them, as the case may be.
I mean, it isn't the only headache for the party at the moment. Appealing to younger voters is another. Let's take a look at this TikTok video from our political reporter, Joshua Nevitt.
How can the Conservatives convince more young people to vote for them?
Historically, I think we have a perception of being the nasty party.
The Conservatives have long struggled to attract younger voters.
None of us dress up in three-piece suits. We just go to the pub, have a darts night and campaign.
But one MP thinks he knows how to win them over. Enter Matt Hancock. He was the Health Secretary during the pandemic. He was on your TV a lot. And then on your TV again, eating kangaroo bits on I'm a Celebrity. He's appearing in the pub behind me, speaking to young people. So why do you think so few young people vote for the Conservative Party?
I think the big issue for why young people don't vote for the Conservative Party comes from the polarisation that we receive on places like TikTok, Twitter and Instagram.
And it's just like, just be normal, like the people who we represent. It's just about being part of modern Britain.
What can the Conservative Party do to encourage more people to vote Conservative?
I think the biggest thing for particularly young people is going to be home ownership.
I do think that housing is of particular concern for young people. That's kind of, for me, that would be the main thing.
If you're under 40, then the Conservatives really have had not enough to offer you in the last few years.
There has been a push in the past for homes are really expensive, let's build some really small rubbish ones. No, homes are really expensive, let's build big ones that people really want to live in the right place where that is accepted. Thank you very much indeed.
So Joshua Nevitt reporting there. Caroline, we saw Matt Hancock, former Conservative Health Secretary, talking about being normal and building more homes and houses to appeal to young voters. Is that what's needed?
Well, it's always very dangerous, isn't it, as a politician, to try and set yourself up as being normal. I don't think I would ever try and claim it. I think the thing that worried me more about that clip, where were the women? And that really scared me about last week's NatCon conference full of men. Now, look, if you want to be a modern, relevant party, do not forget 51% of the population. And I have to say, every day that I go out doing my work as chair of the Women and Equalities Select Committee, I am really conscious that we have to be talking about the issues that are impacting women, whether that's about the right to abortion, whether it's about the right to go out to work or choose to stay at home. I mean, this was a big theme of the conference last week, wasn't it? Telling families that you have to stick together regardless.
Danny Kruger, the MP.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And I do think it's crucially important that we have conversations with the electorate on the issues that they really care about. And when I knock doors in my constituency, let me tell you, the only people who are talking to me about abortion are absolutely terrified 16 to 18-year-old girls who have seen what happened with Roe v Wade in the States, and they want us to step up and really stand up for women's rights to choose.
What does it make you sort of feel about the next election in the way that you've just described your reaction to what you heard at the National Conservatism Conference?
Well, look, we're a broad church, and I'm saying that more and more regularly at the moment, is that it's absolutely critical that those of us on the One Nation wing of the party are prepared to speak up and say, actually, Danny Kruger doesn't speak for me, and Caroline Noakes speaks for me, and she speaks about the issues that impact the people in Romsey and Southampton North. And I think that's going to be absolutely key at the general election, that we emphasise the fact that the Prime Minister is a moderate One Nation Conservative, that we focus on making sure that this isn't about extremes. This is about bringing the Conservative Party back to the centre ground where, guess what? You win elections. You don't win elections on the extreme. The Labour Party learnt that in a very difficult way in 2019.
Madeleine, what do you think it says about the mood of the Conservative Party? Yes, they're examples of young Conservatives worried about the appeal on things like home ownership, but also more broadly the groups that Caroline is talking about. I mean, there seem to be, myriad groups now of Conservatives.
Yeah, and I think essentially at the last election you had two things that really clustered people behind the Conservative Party. You had Jeremy Corbyn, a prospect that really alarmed a lot of people, and you also had deep anger over the way in which Brexit was being thwarted in Parliament. And I think when you take away those two things, the inherent fissures that exist within the Conservative Party have really started to come to the fore. But it's also, I think, I agree with quite a lot of what was said at the conference, to be quite honest. I think it's a shame that, for example, Miriam Cates talking about low birth rates. I think that is a real problem, and you don't have to be Viktor Orban to be worried that there are lots of women who'd love to have more children, but they feel that they can't. And I think it's a shame if the Conservative Party feels that it can no longer speak to issues like family or talk about the importance of marriage. I mean, these were quite anodyne points that were often raised when David Cameron was in charge. I think that some of what was said has been misconstrued in the most unhelpful and the most ungenerous reading of what people were saying. Like the idea that someone like Miriam Cates is some kind of far-right dog whistle is just completely insane.
Caroline, I'll come to you, Clive, in just a minute. Caroline, what do you say to that?
Well, I particularly didn't pick up on Miriam's comments, and I think she has a point about how important it is that women have the ability to decide to stay at home and raise their family if they want to, if they choose, if they can afford to. And I think that's the real issue, if they can afford to. What really offended me was a message received from Danny Kruger, which was basically saying if you're in an unhappy marriage, the only way you can have a safe society is if you stick with that relationship. Now, look, as a divorced woman,
said that.
Well, he did say that.
He quite an ungenerous reading of what he said. Actually.
It was absolutely what he said. In the same way that he stood up in the chamber and said that women should not have bodily autonomy over some issues. Now, look, I find that.
But surely you would say that. I mean, we shouldn't have abortions up to the point of birth. I mean, there's some limits as there are, right?
I would always say that any abortion is an absolute tragedy, but we shouldn't be seeking to demonise women, and effectively that's what it feels like to me, that we are demonising women for the choices that they make. And it's always a difficult choice, isn't it? It's a difficult choice to know whether you should stay at home looking after your baby until they go to school or whether you go back to work immediately, as I did. But we want to make sure that we're actually talking about things in a relevant 21st century way, not going back to the Dark Ages. I don't want to be part of the 1950s.
I just don't think that when Danny Kruger said there are some limits on bodily autonomy already, that's self-evidently true. There are. I don't think that was offensive either. I think people, again, have misinterpreted that in the most extreme possible reading of what he said.
Although he did come back and clarify to some extent what you read from his comments, which was about people staying together, couples staying together, even if the implication was that it was abusive. I mean, this idea of it being a modern sort of face of the Conservative Party, do you think that was lost to some extent in that conference?
Well, I think that when you had the presence of various cabinet ministers, what was actually more of a small C Conservative group of people discussing ideas then became to be emblematic of the party because of the presence of so many of various ministers there, if that makes sense. I think there were plenty of people there that wouldn't vote for the Conservative Party, who are more left-wing economically, who would say that they're small C but not large C Conservatives.
Right. I mean, just very briefly, this in the Times, I mean, a different sort of standpoint. New Tories plot to keep the red wall voting blue, talking about the Tory deputy chairman. I mean, Pippa, On this, of course, is the coalition that Madeleine referred to of the sort of Shire Tories and then Red Wall former areas that voted Labour. They're also wanting calls for lower immigration, lower taxes and, yes, family values too.
Yeah, this is the coalition that any party needs to unite, really, ultimately, but to win an election. And Tony Blair did it with sort of the metropolitan cities. There's a metropolitan constituencies and also some of the more traditional Labour heartlands. And Boris Johnson did it obviously with such huge success with the Red Wall and the so-called Blue Wall, the Shires. But what it looks like is happening now is that is splitting, and Rishi Sunak is not actually managing to capitalise on either of those two core votes that backed them in 2019. And a lot of Tory MPs I speak to are particularly concerned about the Blue Wall because they see what some of this sort of, they interpret as populist stuff that was in that conference, or indeed some of the immigration rhetoric that Suella Braverman, for example, has come out with. They see that, as well as the party's handling of Brexit, as being really off-putting to possibly more socially liberal-minded voters in parts of the southeast, for example.
All right. And we're just going to finish off because I think we can show you Suella Braverman, the Home Secretary, talking to interviewers just as she went into Downing Street a few minutes ago.
Are you going to resign, Home Secretary? Did you break the ministerial code?
In fact, I think I know what she said, which was, I'm here to stop the boats. So or need to stop the boats. And that is a reference to the illegal migration bill that the government is introducing. Let's talk about Labour and Sir Keir Starmer. He's made a speech on the NHS. Let's have a listen.
If all we do in the Labour Party is to place the NHS on a pedestal and leave it there, that's not good enough either. I know that money makes a difference, but it only gets you so far. You can't look at the problems now and tell me it's just about money. That's not serious. You can't ignore the fact the world has changed. That's denying the evidence before our eyes.
Clive, do you agree with that?
Yes.
Yeah,
I do. I think, look, the fact of the matter is the NHS, Keir Starmer's speech, he said that under Labour governments, the NHS is better funded. That's statistically proven. I think we have seen large cuts to the NHS. We've seen an increase in fragmentation, privatisation. Belatedly, we've seen some attempts to try to kind of recohere the NHS and devolve some of those powers out. But it's too little too late. The NHS is in a dire state. And I think that's part of a symptom of both political and economic failure. And look, it's really clear that just throwing more money at the NHS as it's configured isn't going to work. So reform does need to happen. But for me, the principle of that reform must be that the NHS, what makes the NHS so durable and a jewel and something that the Labour politicians and so much of the public, you know, and I would say politicians from across the political spectrum hold the NHS up is that it is something which transcends in many ways as an institution that embodies so much of what we as a country think is the right thing to do, the principles and values. And I think it's about maintaining that in the reforms that we go ahead with. Now, I don't think there is room for enlarging the role of the private sector in the NHS. No, I don't.
Well, can I just show you to the policy document then here? I mean, he didn't say it in his speech, but it is in this Labour Party policy document. The last Labour government reduced waiting times by using the private sector, increasing staff numbers and spreading good practice. We did this before. We will do it again.
OK, look, using the NHS and the private sector to in the short term, take down waiting lists. And I think there are caveats there because it's a zero-sum game. If you're using NHS staff in the private sector, so consultants and other surgeons, it's a zero-sum game. You can't treat those people in the NHS if you're treating them privately. But nonetheless, there may be opportunities to bring down waiting lists using the private sector in the short term. But I don't think there is a role for the private sector in the NHS long term. I think the NHS needs to be purely public. That's how it was set up, and that's a principle.
Will that be problematic for you if
actually, I'm not
like
alone
Tony
inside
Blair,
the Labour
they want
Party
to see
believing. I'm not alone in the Labour Party believing that. It's not about ideology. OK, it's about what works. Look at the care system. Look at adult social care. OK, we have a system which is falling apart because I can give you a quote. Look, a report by the Care of International Corporate Tax Accountability. What three of the biggest care homes in the UK are doing are siphoning off huge sums of money out of the care system while paying staff poverty wages and cutting costs to the bone. Now, that is a system that clearly isn't working when it comes to caring for older people. And you can apply the same thing to the healthcare sector, to primary healthcare. So I just think there is an argument here, what works, and when it comes to looking after people, the public sector is better than the private sector.
Well, this may become an argument that is crystallised over the next 18 months. But where do you think Keir Starmer and Wes Streeting, the Shadow Health Secretary, are? Clive says it's not about ideology, but is it a bit about ideology? Are they where Clive is or somewhere else?
They would also say that it's about pragmatism and doing what works, and that the reality is that, I thought it was very striking today that Keir Starmer committed to Labour government in its first term, delivering on a series of pledges that the Tories currently have for the NHS, and that in itself, so things like
striking or over-ambitious.
Well, it was things like ambulance waiting times and
cancer waiting time
and all of that referrals and so on. But there's been criticism of it for being over-ambitious, and people, which I think really says a lot about what people think about the Conservatives' handling of the NHS currently, or the state of the NHS more generally, I should say. But it's interesting that he's taken those targets as sort of first term. But Tony Blair had more money, and it took him longer, I think it was 7 or 8 years, to sort of reach equivalent targets when he first took over. I know that the NHS has more potential there for reform in terms of digitalisation and so on now, but even so, I think it is quite a hard ask. But he'll have to go further. And it's not just about, as he says initially, getting the NHS back up to a situation where it is no longer, to use his words, on the knees. It's going both further than that and reforming. And that's not a one-term project. It's probably not even a two-term project.
Go on.
I was just going to say, one of the other things, and I think what I do like about the mission statements is that they integrate the approach to this. And what Keir is really clear about is the fact that you cannot fix the problems of the NHS unless you fix wider society. So we know we are now, according to the OECD, the second most unequal country in Europe. Only Bulgaria beats us on that. So you understand that if there are inequalities in housing, in health, in people's life expectancy, we're falling down the ratings for that. And that's going to have an impact on the NHS, which basically absorbs all of that. So you need to be able...
Yeah, but will voters buy it? I mean, this headline, The Times says, Labour insiders criticise Keir Starmer's terrible campaign strategy. These are the 5 missions that you've talked about. I mean, do you think it's going to win voters?
Well, there are a broader set of issues around the campaign strategy, but the actual mission-based approach of seeing the key missions as being integrated across society. What he's saying is you can't fix the NHS unless you're fixing housing, unless you're fixing adult social care, unless you're fixing inequality in society. So these things all matter in terms of keeping people well, not just having an NHS sickness service, having an NHS wellness service. People have to have secure jobs. They have to have,
Is it also an admission, the focus from Keir Starmer and the Labour Party, they've always focused on the NHS, that it's broken under the Conservatives?
Well, look, I think it's very Tony Blair-like, isn't it, to say we're going to stick to the targets that the Conservatives have. Having the guts to talk about reform, I mean, we, and I do use the word we advisedly, we all love the NHS, we all use the NHS. I know I've been a more frequent patient this year than I would have liked. But the stark reality is that you can't just keep throwing money at the problem. I have an email inbox that is absolutely bulging with constituents complaining about some of the admin and bureaucracy challenges in the NHS, talking about referrals from consultants that never actually make it to them. And so I think it's absolutely imperative that, and I get really angry when I hear people talking about an NHS that is dead, because, to be quite frank, every time I go and use the NHS, I find a service that is absolutely brilliant, that is delivering phenomenal outcomes that 20, 30 years ago you would never have dreamt of. The NHS can, and indeed does, do much more now than it ever has done previously.
I mean,
the question is, how do you keep that going?
Well,
how can you sustain that?
How important are things like promises on those 40 new hospitals, I should say, that Boris Johnson made? I mean, here is Sean Linton in the Sunday Times saying the Sunday Times has learnt 5 hospitals with roofs close to collapse will be added to the new hospitals programme at the expense of other NHS trusts who will lose out. I mean, it's not going to happen, is it?
Well, I think it is going to happen, and I think we're going to probably get some announcements on that quite shortly. But I think the real challenge is, do I want to see any hospital with the roof falling in? No, of course I don't. So if you have to reprioritise, you have to reprioritise. And if you're not going to reprioritise, you're going to hike people's taxes by an enormous amount. And it's all of it in politics is about getting that balance right.
Discussion on reform being as important, if not more important, than cash, according to Keir Starmer. Does that change the terms of trade in the arguments and discussions on the NHS?
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? I wonder if the Labour Party, being of the left, has a bit more licence to speak freely about things like reform in a way that the Conservatives might worry that if they did, they'd be accused of stealth privatisation. I mean, you know, in the 19th century, Anthony Trollope wrote that the only political organisation that could disestablish the Church of England was the Conservatives because, again, they were that bit closer to the Church of England. And I wonder if, you know, actually under Keir Starmer you might get more of this kind of discussion and actually... But I do still think that regardless of the words, the conversation that we really need to have about what works around the world, look at who has a functioning healthcare system where there is universal care or those who cannot afford it are topped up by the state. But there is usually a mixture of public and private provision. And there is often some kind of, some kind of co-payment system. Alongside this. I mean, this tends to be at the bedrock of all the successful health services around the world, and we're very alone in having such a centralised system.
I think you can look at the healthcare systems in isolation, but those countries are often far less unequal. People have, you know, will also have more income. So I think if you're going to look at a system like that, you can't look at it simply in isolation. You have to look at a bigger holistic set of issues. I personally think the NHS, as you have no doubt worked out by now, works in a fantastic way. It clearly was, when the Labour government left, one of the most efficient, pound for pound, in terms of money spent of any healthcare system in the world. So I think, you know, if you're going to look at other countries, you also have to look at other things. You know, they have a different housing situation, different terms. You know, they won't have a draconian trade union rules.
And we've got an ageing population that has
And
obviously
we have an ageing
increased
population
since then. All right, let's have a listen to this from Prime Minister's questions last week.
This month marks 23 years since the passing of the late, great Bernie Grant, a former member of this House and the founder of the UK reparations movement in the UK. So I want to ask the Prime Minister today if he will do what Bernie Grant asked all those years ago, what I have asked and what countless others have asked since, and offer a full and meaningful apology for our country's role in slavery and colonialism and commit to reparatory justice.
No, Mr. Speaker. What I think our focus should now be on doing is, of course, understanding our history in all its parts, not running away from it, but right now making sure that we have a society which is inclusive and tolerant of people from all backgrounds. That's something that we on this House, our side of the House, are committed to doing and will continue to deliver, but trying to unpick our history is not the right way forward and is not something that we will focus our energies on.
I don't agree, Clive, with Rishi Sunak. I mean, how have you got involved in this issue?
I got involved through a former colleague of yours, Laura Trevelyan, in many ways. It turns out that Laura, who's just paid a significant amount of money, and there's more to come from her family, works out that it's highly likely that her ancestor owned one of my ancestors, which is quite an intriguing thought. And we've been working together, talking about this, working out, and there is a momentum building across the world for this. We've got the Dutch, who have now apologised and paid a significant sum of money to their former colonies, although there is an issue there about how that's come about. We know that the Portuguese president has now said that this is something that should happen. The Danish are discussing this. All of the CARICOM islands in the Caribbean are unified on this. The African Union are now pushing this as an issue.
Are they using the term reparations?
So it
I
depends.
understood the Dutch government, they've got a fund, as you say.
And I think there's a discussion at the moment. I think for some people it's an apology for what happened, which has never happened, which I think is quite shocking. But I think in terms of the money, there are some people who are calling for reparations for the act of slavery, saying that the UK and other countries should live up to the ideals which they say they live by, the morality, the law, the laws-based order that we all say that we agree with and adhere to. But there are others who think that actually it's the dire state that the Caribbean was left in economically after 400 years of slavery and colonialism, and it's that the UK and other countries need to address.
And how would you quantify that?
So how would you quantify it? Well, you've got the Caribbean islands, which were ruthlessly exploited, slavery, extractionism, then the colonialism that took place after, then the today's figures, hundreds of billions of pounds that were paid to the slave owners and not the slaves, and then you begin to build up a picture whereby the CARICOM countries have now come together with a set of asks, economic asks, to the European Union and to the United Kingdom, saying, help us rebuild our economies because they are in tatters with the climate crisis approaching, and we're asking you to help us, not give us more debt, not take more from us, but to help us. I think it's a fair ask.
Caroline, do you support the idea of reparations for slavery?
Well, I think you asked the right question, then. How do you quantify it? Payment to whom and by whom? And fundamentally, this is asking the British taxpayer to stump up at a time when, as the Prime Minister said, we should be focusing on how we can bring our communities together and focus on the challenges that we have here. So I think it's a really difficult question and a really difficult time.
Right. I mean, do you think, though, the principle of some sort of compensation, either
not to individuals? I don't think I'm not arguing for that. It should be at the state level.
So I think that the Trevelyan Fund, which has been put into, I think, an educational fund, is a potential way forward. But, you know, I go back to whom, how do you select who gets the benefit from that and how much? And, you know, is it going to be my constituents, Clive's constituents who are paying for it?
Madeline?
And also, to what extent is it different from other aid money that has historically gone into the Caribbean from the West? You know, I don't really like the idea of there being some kind of collective responsibility because, you know, history is very complicated. In this country, very few people actually saw the benefits of slavery. Most of our ancestors were very poor and they lived lives of, you know, drudgery and misery. And so I don't really see that there is collective responsibility for all living taxpayers for atrocities that were committed. And meanwhile, I think actually that the discussion of reparations means that we're not discussing present-day atrocities. So, for instance, billions of pounds have flooded into the Caribbean in the last few years from China, a country that is carrying out slave labour and slavery right now as we speak. I think that's the more urgent, dealing with present-day atrocities, not trying to relitigate the past.
I think this is an excellent discussion, and I think that's the starting point for this. I think in terms of, you know, where the money goes, it doesn't go to individuals. I think in terms of the point that's been made about how you use this money, I think it goes to the. I think the countries of the Caribbean now are putting together the economic arguments for how their educational, social, economic, healthcare infrastructure is invested in. I think the issue about who pays for this, it's very clear that the proceeds of 400 years of slavery, colonialism and empire were not equally shared out in this country. It's one of the things I come onto your programme every couple of months and bang on about. So I think it does mean that we have to think about where that comes from. I think some people have done very well from that for over a number of centuries, and that opens up the issue of wealth taxes and how that's spent and where that can go. So I think these are arguments which are really interesting, the fact that people are beginning to engage with them. And I also understand, you know, the point that people are making that this doesn't seem fair, that we should be paying for something that happened 400 years ago. But the fact of the matter is we're still benefiting from that today. And I think the issue with China is really important because when I talk to Conservatives about this issue, it's the one thing that picks their ears up because they understand when you talk about foreign aid, Grenada, over 10 years, we spent in this country about 10 pence per person per year. So I think it shows you how much money in foreign aid is going to the Caribbean. It's very little.
Madeline?
But you see that the irony there is that it's exchanging, it is a form of colonialism, what China is doing. And it seems like it's, you know, it's choosing between different varieties of colonialism. And I'm not really sure that I get that. And the other point I would make just about the wealth from slavery is actually, out of all the cities in the UK, they want some of the biggest slave cities, Liverpool, Glasgow, are now some of the poorest and most unequal and most suffering places, which I think is a testament to the fact that what really made this country rich was actually not slavery. It was to do with commerce and the Industrial Revolution.
What about it as a political issue and conversation? Do you think we're going to be talking about this a lot more?
I think we probably should be, but I think it has to be handled very sensitively, obviously, because some people do have very strong views on it. And I'm not sure that sort of dismissals are, as we saw in the clip, are necessarily very helpful. It's not just a historical issue for some of the reasons that Clive has said, but also because there are many descendants from the Caribbean islands and from slavery that live in the country now, Britain now, and feel very strongly about it. And saying that we want to be sort of tolerant of everybody from wherever they come from, well, that also includes people who come from the Caribbean originally and regard it as really important for them. But of course, it's not a black and white issue. It's very important that concerns over where the money comes from and goes too are addressed. I mean, I should say that The Guardian, my employer, recently launched a programme of restorative justice because it was founded by Manchester mercantiles who benefited from slavery, and they set up a fund and also an education programme. And I suspect we'll see more companies in the future doing things like that.
Well, that's all we have time for today. Thank you to all of my guests. I'll be back tomorrow with more Politics Live at 12:15 here on BBC Two and the iPlayer. But from all of us here, have a very good afternoon. Bye-bye.